The man I was replacing handed me a brass ring with 11 keys on it, a binder labeled Operations, a small spiral notebook that did not have anything written on the cover, and a set of work boots that he said were the spare pair he kept at the lock house, and that he wanted me to have because his feet had finally given out and he would not be needing them anymore. He told me the keys were for the various structures on the property. He told me the binder was the official operations manual from the Canal Corporation, which I would need to follow for all the standard procedures. He told me the spiral notebook was his own personal addendum to the manual, with notes he had developed over 31 years on the lock, and that I should read it before my first overnight shift and should keep it accessible in the lock house. He said the boots were optional, but recommended. His name was Walter Henning. He was 68. He was retiring at the end of October because his wife had been pushing him to retire for the past 5 years, and he had run out of reasons to argue with her. He had been the lock keeper at Lock 17 on the Erie Canal Trail since 1993. The Canal Corporation had hired me to replace him through a regional employment posting. I had been a maintenance technician at a hydroelectric facility in Pennsylvania for the previous 12 years before being laid off in the spring when the facility had been sold to a larger utility that had restructured its operations and eliminated my position. The lock keeper job was a step down in pay and seniority, but it came with on-site housing in the small wooden lock house, full benefits, and in a position with the New York State Canal Corporation that, by every account I had been given during the hiring process, was as secure as government work got. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I am asking because the events I am about to describe occurred during overnight shifts over the past 8 months, and I want to know how many of you are awake at the kind of hours when locks are supposed to be closed and quiet. I am 46 years old. I had been divorced for 3 years when I took the position. My ex-wife and I had no children. I had no immediate family within driving distance. The isolation of the lockkeeper job, which Walter had warned me about during my interview, had not concerned me. And I had told Walter and the regional supervisor, who had also interviewed me, that I had been looking for a quiet position in a remote location, and that the on-site housing was actually an attraction rather than a drawback. I had moved my belongings into the lock house in late October and had begun my orientation week with Walter on October 23rd. The orientation week was thorough. Walter walked me through every aspect of the operation. He showed me how to operate the lock gates, which were the original 1918 mechanisms with a few electrical retrofits added in the 1970s. He showed me how to monitor the water levels in the upper and lower pools. He showed me the radio system that connected the lock to the Canal Corporation's regional dispatch in Syracuse. He showed me the maintenance schedule for the various pumps and valves. And he showed me the visitor log that I would need to maintain for any boats that passed through the lock during operating season, which ran from May through October. He showed me the winter shutdown procedures, which I would be implementing in the coming weeks because the lock was scheduled to close for the season on November 1st. The lock house itself was a small wooden structure built in 1922 that had been the lockkeeper's residence since its construction. The house had 2 rooms downstairs, a kitchen and a sitting room, and 2 small bedrooms upstairs along with a bathroom. The house was heated by a wood stove in the sitting room and by a propane furnace that supplemented the stove during the coldest months. The water came from a well that had been drilled in 1965. The electricity came from a power line that ran along the canal access road. The phone was a landline that had been installed in the 1980s and that worked as a phone, but not for internet, which the lockhouse did not have. There was no cell service in the area. The radio system was the only reliable communication available during overnight hours. Walter walked me through the binder during the third day of my orientation. The binder was a thick 3-ring binder with the Canal Corporation's logo on the cover, and it contained the official operations manual, the safety procedures, the emergency protocols, and the various forms I would need to file for routine reporting. The binder was approximately 200 pages long. Walter went through each section with me, explaining the procedures and answering my questions. Yet the procedures were straightforward. The work was the kind of work that required attention, but not creativity. On the 5th day of my orientation, Walter brought out the spiral notebook. He sat me down at the kitchen table in the lockhouse with the notebook between us. He opened it. The notebook was about half full of handwritten entries. The handwriting was small and careful. The first entries were dated 1993. The most recent entries were from earlier that year. Walter said, "Daniel, I want to tell you about this notebook. The notebook is not part of the official operations manual. The notebook is not authorized by the Canal Corporation. The notebook is my personal record of certain practical issues at this lock that the official manual does not address. The notebook contains procedures that I have developed over 31 years to handle situations that the official manual would not, by my judgment, handle adequately. I am giving the notebook to you because the situations are still occurring at this lock, and you will need to know how to handle them. I am asking you to read the notebook carefully before your first overnight shift. I am asking you to follow the procedures in it. I am asking you to keep the notebook private from the Canal Corporation, because if the corporation became aware of the situations the notebook describes, they would respond in ways that would, by my judgment, make the situations worse rather than better." I asked him what kinds of situations he was talking about. He said, "I am going to let the notebook explain. I am not going to walk you through the entries. The entries explain themselves. If you have questions after you read the notebook, you can call me. I am leaving you my phone number on a card that I have taped to the inside cover of the notebook. The number is my home line in Rochester. My wife and I will be moving to Florida at the end of November. The number will work until then. After that, I will get you a new number. Please do not call unless you have read the notebook and have a specific question. I am about to retire after 31 years of dealing with the situations the notebook describes, and I would like to spend my retirement not thinking about them as much as I can manage to." I told him I understood. I asked him whether he could give me a general sense of what the notebook contained. He said, "And the notebook contains procedures related to overnight observations at the lock during the off-season. The off-season is the period from November 1st through May 1st, when the lock is closed to traffic and when the lockkeeper's primary duty is to maintain the property and to monitor the equipment for any winter damage. The off-season is also the period when the situations the notebook describes are most active. The official manual treats the off-season as a quiet period that requires only routine maintenance. The notebook treats the off-season as the period that requires the most attention. The notebook will explain why. I am asking you to trust me that the notebook is necessary, even though some of what it describes will, on first reading, sound implausible." I read the notebook that night, and I read it in my new bedroom in the lockhouse, which I had been using since I had moved in, even though Walter was still occupying the other bedroom during the orientation week. I read it carefully. I read it twice. The notebook was organized chronologically, with entries dated as Walter had encountered each situation and as he had refined his procedures for handling it. The earliest entries were from 1993, his first year on the lock, and were short and observational. They described unusual sounds at the lock during overnight hours, lights that appeared on the canal at night when no boats were authorized to be on the water, and instances when the lock gates had operated by themselves despite the manual controls being locked out for the season. Walter's early entries did not include procedures for handling these situations, and they were just records of his observations. The entries from his second year, 1994, included his first attempts at procedures. He had developed a routine for the overnight monitoring of the lock during the off-season that involved checking the gates and the water levels at specific times, recording his observations, and not investigating any unusual sounds or lights that he encountered. The procedures were practical and minimal. They were the kind of procedures that a careful observer would develop after a year of encountering situations he could not explain. The entries from his third year, 1995, included his first encounter with what he called, in the notebook, the boat at bearing 290. The entry described an event that had occurred on the night of February 8th. Walter had been on his overnight rounds, yet he had walked from the lock house down to the lower pool of the lock to check the ice on the water and to verify that the gate seals were intact. The lower pool was visible from a small wooden walkway that ran along the edge of the canal. Walter had been on the walkway when he had observed, on the canal water below him, the silhouette of a small boat. The boat had been positioned in the middle of the canal, approximately 50 feet from the walkway. The boat had been a wooden rowboat with a single occupant sitting in it. The occupant had been facing toward the lock house. Walter had been startled. He had called out to the occupant. The occupant had not responded. Walter had retreated to the lock house and had retrieved a flashlight, which he had not been carrying because the moonlight had been sufficient for his rounds. Yet he had returned to the walkway. The boat was no longer there. The water was empty. There had been no sound of a boat moving on the water during the few minutes Walter had been retrieving the flashlight. The boat had simply not been there when he had returned. Walter had logged the incident in the notebook. He had developed, over the following years, a procedure for handling the boat. The procedure was straightforward. If Walter observed the boat during his overnight rounds, he was to acknowledge the boat verbally by saying out loud, "I see you. I am the lock keeper. I am going about my duties." He was then to continue with his rounds without interacting with the boat further. He was not to call out to the occupant. He was not to retrieve a flashlight or any other equipment. He was not to leave the immediate area of the walkway during the period the boat was visible. He was simply to acknowledge the boat and to continue. The notebook documented Walter's encounters with the boat across 30 years. The encounters had occurred at irregular intervals, sometimes years apart, sometimes within a few weeks of each other. The boat had appeared most often in the early winter and the early spring, during the off-season, although it had also appeared a few times during the operating season, which was unusual. The encounters had followed a consistent pattern. Walter would observe the boat. The boat would be in the same general position in the middle of the canal. The occupant would be facing the lock house. Walter would acknowledge the boat using the prescribed words. As the boat would remain visible for between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, the boat would then no longer be visible. Walter's notebook entries described the consequences he had observed when the procedure had been deviated from. He had, on 3 occasions in his 31 years, deviated from the procedure. The first deviation had been in 1996, when he had attempted to take a photograph of the boat using a film camera he had brought with him on his rounds. The film had developed without any image of the boat, which had been expected, but Walter had also developed a chest cold the following day that had lasted 3 weeks, and that had been more severe than any cold he had previously had. He had attributed the cold to the cold weather initially, but had come to believe, over time, that the cold had been related to his attempt to photograph the boat. The second deviation had been in 2003, when he had called out to the occupant by name. He had not known the occupant's name, but he had used a generic call, addressing the occupant as Sir. The occupant had, by Walter's account, slowly turned to face Walter directly for the first time. Walter had not been able to make out the occupant's face in the dim light, but he had felt, in that moment, that the occupant had registered his presence in a way that the occupant had not registered Walter's presence in any previous encounter. Walter had retreated to the lock house. He had been unable to sleep that night. The following morning, the lock gates had been operating on their own when he had gone outside to do his morning checks. The gates had been opening and closing at intervals of approximately 10 minutes, despite the manual controls being locked out. Walter had been unable to stop the gates without violating the lockout procedure that the Canal Corporation required during the off-season. He had called the regional dispatch and had reported the gates as malfunctioning. A maintenance crew had come the following day and had been unable to identify any mechanical reason for the malfunction. The gates had stopped operating on their own approximately 12 hours after they had started, before the maintenance crew had arrived. The maintenance crew had attributed the malfunction to a transient electrical issue and had filed a report. The third deviation had been in 2014, when Walter had attempted to leave the immediate area of the walkway during a sighting, and he had been concerned that the boat was, by its position, blocking his ability to access a maintenance valve that he needed to check. He had walked along the walkway toward the maintenance valve, which had required him to move closer to the boat. The boat had remained in position as he had walked. As he had reached the section of the walkway closest to the boat, the occupant had stood up. The occupant had not previously stood up in any of Walter's encounters. The occupant had been a man of average height, wearing what Walter described as old-fashioned clothing, with a beard and dark hair. The occupant had stepped from the boat onto the surface of the water and had begun to walk toward the walkway. Walter had retreated immediately back along the walkway, away from the maintenance valve, and had returned to the lock house, and he had locked the door of the lock house. He had stayed inside for the rest of the night. He had not gone outside again until full daylight the following morning. The next morning, Walter had gone to check the maintenance valve. He had found the valve in normal working order. He had also found, on the walkway, a single wet footprint. The footprint had been the size of a man's foot. The footprint had been wet, despite the fact that the morning had been cold and dry, with no precipitation overnight. The footprint had been pointing in the direction of the lock house. The footprint had been the only one. There had been no other footprints leading to or from it. I read these accounts in Walter's notebook. I read them with the kind of attention that you give to documents that describe things you have not personally experienced and that you are trying to determine whether to take seriously. I did not, on first reading, take them seriously. The accounts described phenomena that fit no framework I was familiar with. The accounts were detailed and consistent, but the consistency could have been the consistency of a writer who was either fabricating events for some purpose or who was, possibly, experiencing some kind of unusual psychological phenomenon over the course of his 31 years on the lock. I did not know Walter well enough to assess which possibility was more likely. I had been with him for 5 days at the time I read the notebook. He had seemed, during those 5 days, to be a competent and reasonable person. Yet he had not displayed any obvious signs of cognitive issues. He had not seemed to be the kind of person who would fabricate accounts of supernatural phenomena for amusement, or for any other purpose I could identify. I considered the possibility that Walter was using the notebook as a kind of test or initiation, the way some long-tenured employees use elaborate stories to amuse or unsettle new hires. I considered this possibility and decided that the notebook did not feel like a test. The handwriting was too consistent across 30 years. The procedures were too detailed. The references to Canal Corporation maintenance reports, which Walter said could be verified through the corporation's records, were too specific. I decided to take a middle approach, and I decided that I would follow the procedures in Walter's notebook during my first off-season, on the grounds that following them would not be difficult and that the cost of following them would be small. I decided that I would not actively investigate or test the procedures. I decided that I would, during the course of the off-season, develop my own assessment of whether the procedures were necessary, and would adjust my approach in subsequent off-seasons based on what I observed. I told Walter the following morning that I had read the notebook. I told him I had questions. I asked him whether he could clarify a few specific points. He said he could. I asked him whether he had ever shown the notebook to anyone other than me. He said no. He had told no one about the notebook. He had not even told his wife. Said he had developed the procedures alone over 31 years, and he had not discussed them with anyone other than me. I asked him why he had not told anyone. He said, "I have not told anyone because I would not have been believed, and because the telling would have created problems for me without producing any benefit. I have considered, on multiple occasions over the years, whether to tell my wife. I have decided each time not to. The decision has not been an easy one. I have carried the situation alone for 31 years, and the carrying has been a burden. I have decided to give the notebook to you, because you are taking over the position, and you will need to know. I am not asking you to do anything beyond what I have done, which is to follow the procedures and to not discuss them with the Canal Corporation or with anyone else who would not be helpful. I asked him whether he had ever tried to identify the man in the boat. He said yes. He had spent considerable time during the early years of his tenure researching the history of the lock and of the canal in this section. The lock had been built in 1918 as part of the New York State barge canal expansion that had replaced the original 1825 Erie Canal. The lock had been operational since 1918 and had been continuously staffed by a lockkeeper for its entire operational history. Walter had been the 7th lockkeeper at Lock 17. The first lockkeeper, a man named Edward Halloran, had been at the lock from 1918 until 1923. Yet he had left the position after a year of declining health and had died of pneumonia at age 39 in 1924. The second lockkeeper, a man named James Whitfield, had been at the lock from 1923 until 1947. He had retired and had moved to live with his daughter in Albany. The third lockkeeper, a woman named Margaret Doyle, had been at the lock from 1947 until 1962. She had been one of the first women to hold a lockkeeper position in the New York State Canal system. She had retired and had died in 1971. The fourth lockkeeper, a man named Frank Castellano, had been at the lock from 1962 until 1978. He had left the position after he had been arrested for fraud unrelated to his lock duties and had been convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. The fifth lockkeeper, a man named Robert Adamson, had been at the lock from 1978 until 1985. He had been killed in an automobile accident on the Canal Access Road in 1985 while returning to the lock house from a trip to town. The sixth lockkeeper, a man named Lyle Brennan, had been at the lock from 1985 until 1993. He had retired due to a back injury that had prevented him from continuing the physical work the position required. He had died in 1998 of an unrelated heart condition. Walter had, by his account, been able to make contact with the surviving lock keepers or their families during his early research. Margaret Doyle had been alive in the early 1990s when Walter had begun his research. He had visited her at her apartment in Utica in 1994. She had been 91 years old. She had been in good mental health. She had told Walter that she had encountered the boat during her tenure at the lock, that she had developed her own informal procedures for handling it, and that she had passed her procedures along to Frank Castellano when he had taken over from her in 1962. She had also told Walter that she had inherited her procedures from James Whitfield when she had taken over from him in 1947, and that James had told her he had inherited his from Edward Halloran when he had taken over from Edward in 1923. The chain went back to Edward Halloran, the first lock keeper, who had been at the lock during its first 5 years of operation. Walter had researched Edward Halloran's history. Edward had been a canal worker for the New York State Barge Canal Authority since the construction of the lock in 1916. He had been one of the workers on the construction crew. He had been promoted to lock keeper when the lock had become operational in 1918. He had served as lock keeper until 1923, when he had taken sick leave for what was described in his personnel file as respiratory illness with associated nervous exhaustion. He had not returned to the position. He had died in 1924 by the death certificate from pneumonia at age 39. Walter had been unable in his research to identify the man in the boat. He had considered the possibility that the man was Edward Halloran himself, or that the man was someone connected to Edward's tenure at the lock. The man's clothing, by Walter's description across multiple sightings, was consistent with the early 20th century, which would have placed him in the era of Edward's tenure. But Walter had not been able to verify any specific identification. Edward's family had been small. He had died unmarried, with no children. His parents had been deceased before his own death. He had a brother who had moved to California in 1930, and whose descendants Walter had not been able to locate. There had been no photographs of Edward in the Canal Corporation's archives, or in any other source Walter had been able to access. I asked Walter whether Margaret Doyle had told him anything about the man. Walter said, "She told me one thing in particular that I have remembered. She told me that she had once asked Edward Halloran about the boat, when she had been a young woman working as a clerk in the Canal Corporation's regional office in the 1940s. Edward had been retired by then, in the sense that he had left the lock keeper position. Although he had been dead for over 20 years, Margaret had meant that she had asked another Canal employee, a man who had known Edward during his tenure, what Edward had said about the boat. The other employee had told Margaret that Edward had told him, shortly before Edward had taken his sick leave in 1923, that the boat was not the danger. The boat was a warning. The danger was something else. Edward had not said what the danger was. The other employee had not asked, because Edward had been visibly unwell at the time and had not wanted to discuss the matter further. Margaret had asked the other employee what he thought Edward had meant. The other employee had said he did not know. Margaret had told me in 1994 that she had spent her own years at the lock trying to figure out what the danger was, and that she had not been able to figure it out, and that she had, at some point, decided to stop trying. I asked Walter what he thought the danger was. He said, "I do not know. I have spent 31 years on this lock. I have followed the procedures. I have observed the boat. I have not identified the danger. I have come to believe that the boat is, in some sense, exactly what Edward said it was, which is a warning." I do not know what it is warning of. I do not know whether the danger has occurred during my tenure, and I have somehow avoided it by following the procedures, or whether the danger has not yet occurred and is still pending. I have come to think that the procedures may be sufficient regardless of what the danger is. I have come to think that following the procedures may be the way to avoid the danger. Yet even without knowing what the danger is, this is what I have come to think after 31 years. I am not certain. I am giving you the procedures because they are what I have. I am asking you to follow them. I told him I would. He left the lock house on October 31st. He drove away in the small pickup truck he had brought to the lock for his retirement move. The truck was loaded with his personal belongings. He waved to me from the driver's seat as he pulled out onto the access road. I watched the truck until it disappeared around the first bend in the road. The dust hung in the air for a long time after the truck was gone. I was alone at the lock for the first time. The lock had closed for the season at noon that day, with the last boat of the operating season having passed through earlier in the morning. Yet the off-season had officially begun. I did my first overnight shift that night. I followed the procedures from Walter's notebook. I did the standard rounds at the standard times. I checked the gates and the water levels. I did not encounter the boat. I did not encounter anything unusual. The night passed quietly. I want to tell you what happened during the first 3 months of my off-season, because the first 3 months were the period during which I came to believe that Walter's procedures were, in fact, necessary. 048, the first encounter with the boat, occurred on the night of December 18th, approximately 7 weeks after Walter had left. I had done my evening rounds at 6 o'clock, before sunset, and had returned to the lock house for dinner. I had done my next set of rounds at 10 o'clock, in the dark, by flashlight. The temperature had been below freezing for several days. Patches of ice had formed on the calmer sections of the canal water, although the main channel had remained open. I had completed my 10 o'clock rounds without incident and had returned to the lock house. I had been planning to do my next rounds at 2 in the morning, which was the standard schedule Walter had developed. At approximately 1:45 in the morning, I heard a sound from outside the lock house. The sound was distant and brief, yet the sound was the kind of sound that wood makes when it shifts under stress, a single creak, followed by silence. I considered the sound. The lock house had a number of structural features that could have produced such a sound, including the wooden walkway along the canal, the wooden steps that led down from the lock house to the walkway, and the various wooden components of the lock gates themselves. Any of these could have produced the sound. I made a note of the sound and continued preparing for my 2 o'clock rounds. I went outside at 2 o'clock. I had my flashlight, my notebook for recording observations, and the handheld radio that the Canal Corporation required me to carry during overnight shifts. I walked from the lock house down to the lower pool of the lock, following the same route Walter had developed and that I had been following since the start of the off-season. The route took me along the wooden walkway that ran along the edge of the canal. I reached the section of the walkway that overlooked the lower pool. I looked at the water. The boat was on the water. The boat was approximately 50 feet from the walkway. In the middle of the canal, the boat was a small wooden rowboat. There was a single occupant in the boat. The occupant was sitting facing the lock house with his back to the upstream direction. I want to be precise about what I did next, because the procedure had been specific. I stopped walking. I stood on the walkway. I did not approach the boat. I did not retreat. I held my flashlight pointed at the walkway boards in front of me, not at the boat. I spoke out loud. I said, "I see you. I am the lock keeper." I am going about my duties. I had practiced the words during the previous weeks, on the chance that I would need to use them. I had felt during the practice that the words were strange and that I was unlikely to ever use them in earnest. Saying them out loud at 2 a.m, in the cold, with the boat visible in front of me, did not feel strange. The words felt practical in the way that emergency procedures feel practical when you find yourself actually needing them. I waited. The boat did not move. The occupant did not respond. I had not expected him to respond. Walter's notebook had not described any responses from the occupant in any of his 31 years of encounters. I continued my rounds. I walked the length of the walkway, checking the gate seals and the water levels at the various inspection points. The boat remained visible during my entire rounds. I could see it in my peripheral vision as I worked. I did not look at it directly. I did not acknowledge it again. I did what Walter's notebook had told me to do. I completed my rounds in approximately 15 minutes. I walked back along the walkway toward the lockhouse. As I passed the section of the walkway that overlooked the lower pool, I glanced at the water. The boat was no longer there. The water was empty. The occupant was gone. I returned to the lockhouse. I locked the door. I sat at the kitchen table. I logged the encounter in Walter's notebook, in the section he had left for me at the back of the notebook. I described the time of the encounter, the position of the boat, the appearance of the occupant, the words I had spoken, and the duration of the visibility. The notebook entry was brief and factual. I tried to keep my hands steady as I wrote. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the kitchen until sunrise. I made coffee at 5:30. I did my morning rounds at 7 o'clock, in daylight. The walkway and the canal looked normal in the morning light. There was no sign that anything had been on the water during the night. The water was still and quiet. I called Walter that morning at the number he had left me. He picked up on the third ring. He sounded older than I remembered him sounding during my orientation. He had been retired for less than 2 months, but his voice had taken on the quality of a person who was no longer working. I told him about the encounter. I described the boat, the occupant, my acknowledgement, and the disappearance. I asked him whether the encounter had been consistent with what he had observed during his tenure. He said it had been. He said the timing was about right for the first encounter of an off-season, which had typically occurred for him in late November or December. He said the position of the boat and the behavior of the occupant matched what he had described in the notebook. He said the disappearance of the boat after I had completed my rounds was the standard pattern. He said I had handled the encounter correctly. I asked him whether there was anything I should be doing differently going forward. He said, "No. You have done what the procedures require. The procedures are sufficient for the standard encounters. You will probably encounter the boat again during the off-season, possibly several times. You should follow the same procedures each time. Do not modify them. Do not test them. Do not try to learn anything new about the boat. The procedures are what we have. They have worked for many decades. They will continue to work as long as you follow them." I asked him whether he was doing all right in his retirement. He said he was. He had been getting used to having time to himself. He had been reading more than he had read in years. His wife had been pleased to have him at home. They were planning to leave for Florida in 2 weeks after they had finished selling the house in Rochester. I thanked him. We hung up. I had 3 more encounters with the boat during December and January. The encounters followed the pattern of the first one. I observed the boat during my overnight rounds. I acknowledged the boat using the prescribed words. I continued my rounds. The boat remained visible for several minutes. The boat was no longer visible when I completed my rounds and returned along the walkway. The encounters were unsettling, but were manageable. I logged each one in the notebook. I did not call Walter about them. I did not need to. The procedure was working. I want to tell you about the encounter on February 8th, because the encounter on February 8th was different from the previous ones. The night of February 8th was cold. The temperature was below 0 Fahrenheit. The canal water had partially frozen, with a thin layer of ice covering most of the surface, although the main channel near the lock had remained open due to the slight current that was maintained for winter operation. And I had been doing my rounds wearing the heaviest coat I owned, a wool hat, gloves, and the spare boots Walter had given me, which had turned out to be excellent for the cold. I had done my evening rounds at 6. I had done my 10 o'clock rounds. I had been planning to do my 2 in the morning rounds when, at approximately 1:40 in the morning, I heard the sound. The sound was the same single creak that I had heard before the December 18th encounter. The sound was distant and brief. The sound was clearly from outside the lock house, somewhere in the vicinity of the walkway or the lock gates. I had come to recognize the sound over the previous 2 months as a kind of announcement that the boat was about to appear. The sound had preceded each of the 4 encounters I had logged. I prepared for my rounds, and I dressed in my cold weather gear. I took my flashlight, notebook, and radio. I went outside. I walked from the lock house down to the walkway. The night was cold and still. The moonlight was bright. I could see the canal and the lock structures clearly without the flashlight, although I kept the flashlight ready. I reached the section of the walkway that overlooked the lower pool. I looked at the water. There was no boat on the water. I want to be precise about this. The water was visible. The position where the boat had appeared on each of the previous 4 encounters was empty. The ice on the edges of the canal was undisturbed. There was no sign of any boat. I waited on the walkway. I considered the possibility that the boat had not yet appeared and that it might appear during the next few minutes. As I waited for approximately 10 minutes, the water remained empty. I considered the possibility that the boat had appeared earlier in the evening, before my rounds, and that I had missed it. The procedure had not addressed this possibility. The procedure had assumed that I would observe the boat during my rounds, when I was on the walkway. The procedure had not addressed what to do if I did not observe the boat at all, but had heard the sound that had preceded each of the previous encounters. I decided to continue my rounds. I walked the length of the walkway, checking the gate seals and the water levels. I completed the inspection in approximately 15 minutes. I returned to the lock house. I locked the door. I sat at the kitchen table. I tried to think about what to do. The sound had occurred. The boat had not appeared. Yet the procedure had not anticipated this combination. I did not know whether the absence of the boat meant that the situation was different in some way that I should be concerned about, or whether the absence simply meant that the sound and the boat were not as tightly connected as I had assumed, and that I had been mistaken to identify the sound as a precursor to the boat's appearance. I made a decision. I decided to log the absence in the notebook and to continue with my normal procedures for the rest of the night. I logged the entry. I did not call Walter. I decided I would call Walter the following morning, after I had had time to think about whether the absence required any specific response. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in my bed in the lock house and I listened to the building. The lock house was quiet, and the wind outside was minimal. I could hear the occasional creak of the wooden structure as the temperature changed. I could not hear anything unusual. At approximately 3:30 in the morning, I heard a sound from inside the lock house. The sound was footsteps. The footsteps were on the wooden floor of the kitchen, which was directly below my bedroom. The footsteps were slow and deliberate. The footsteps were the kind of footsteps that a person makes when they are walking through a room that they are familiar with, in dim lighting, taking care not to bump into furniture. I sat up in bed. I held my breath. The footsteps continued. They moved across the kitchen, paused near the back door, and then moved toward the staircase that led to the second floor. The footsteps started up the staircase. I want to tell you what I did next, because the decision was made under stress, and I am not certain it was the correct decision. I got out of bed quietly. I picked up the flashlight from my bedside table. I did not turn it on. I went to the bedroom door. The bedroom door was closed, but not locked. I had not locked it because I had not anticipated needing to lock it. The lockkeeper position was a solitary position. There had been no one in the lock house other than me since Walter had left. I held the door handle. I listened. The footsteps were on the staircase, moving up. The staircase had 13 steps. The footsteps had reached approximately the 7th step, by my count of the timing. I opened the door of my bedroom. I stepped into the hallway. The hallway was dark. The staircase was at the end of the hallway, yet I could see the upper section of the staircase from my position at the bedroom door. I could not see the person on the staircase yet, because the staircase had a turn at the top that obscured the lower steps. I stood in the hallway. The footsteps continued up the stairs. The person reached the top of the staircase. The person was a man. The man was wearing dark clothing that I could not identify clearly in the dim light from the hallway window. The man had a beard. The man had dark hair. The man was by every visible characteristic the man I had observed in the boat during my 4 encounters since December. The man was standing at the top of the staircase, in the hallway, approximately 15 feet from me. I did not move. I did not speak. I did not turn on the flashlight. I held the flashlight at my side. I waited. The man did not move toward me. He stood at the top of the staircase. He looked down the hallway in my direction. I could not tell, in the dim light, whether he could see me or whether he was simply looking in the general direction of my bedroom door without registering my specific presence. After what I would estimate was approximately 30 seconds, the man turned around. He started walking back down the staircase. The footsteps were the same slow and deliberate footsteps I had heard going up. He descended the 13 steps. He reached the bottom of the staircase. He walked across the kitchen floor. He paused near the back door. The back door of the lock house was the door that led from the kitchen out to the small back porch and to the path down to the walkway. I heard the back door open. I heard it close. Yet the footsteps were no longer audible. I stood in the hallway for several minutes. I listened. The lock house was quiet. The man had left through the back door. I had not heard him outside the lock house after he had left, but the lock house walls were thick enough that I might not have heard footsteps on the gravel path, even if he had walked away normally. I went back to my bedroom. I closed the door. I locked it using the small interior latch that I had not used before. I sat on the edge of the bed. I tried to think. The procedure that Walter had developed had not anticipated this. The procedure had been about the boat, about acknowledging the boat at the walkway, about not approaching the boat, about not investigating the boat. The procedure had not addressed the possibility that the man from the boat could enter the lock house. And this procedure had not addressed what to do if the man came up the staircase to the second floor. The procedure had not addressed what to do if the man could be encountered face to face in the lockhouse itself. I tried to think about whether I had violated any of the procedures in a way that might have caused the situation. I had followed the procedure for the boat encounters in December and January. I had spoken the prescribed words. I had not approached the boat. I had not investigated. I had completed my rounds normally. I had logged the encounters in the notebook. The only deviation I could identify was that, on the night of February 8th, I had not observed the boat. The sound had occurred, but the boat had not appeared. The procedure had been built around the assumption that the sound would be followed by the boat's appearance, and that I would acknowledge the boat. I had not been able to acknowledge the boat because the boat had not appeared. The acknowledgement had not happened. I considered the possibility that the acknowledgement was not just a courtesy, but was the operative part of the procedure. I considered the possibility that the acknowledgement had been the thing that had kept the man in the boat and had prevented him from doing other things, including coming into the lockhouse. I considered the possibility that the absence of the acknowledgement on the night of February 8th had freed the man to do something other than appear in the boat, and that what he had chosen to do was to come into the lockhouse. I sat on the edge of the bed. I checked my watch. It was 3:47 in the morning. I had several hours until sunrise. I decided to call Walter. I went downstairs. I did not turn on any lights. I felt my way through the kitchen to the phone, which was on a small table near the back door. I picked up the phone. I dialed Walter's number. The phone rang 4 times. Walter's wife answered. She sounded tired. She told me Walter was asleep. I told her my name. I told her it was an emergency. I asked her to wake him. She woke him. He came to the phone. He sounded confused but alert. I told him what had happened. I told him about the absence of the boat. I told him about the footsteps. I told him about the man on the staircase. I told him I was calling because the procedure had not addressed the situation, and I needed to know what to do. Walter was quiet for a long time. He said, "Daniel, I am going to tell you something I should have included in the notebook. I did not include it because I had thought it was not relevant. I had been wrong. I am sorry." He said, "When I was in my 3rd year on the lock in 1995, I had an encounter that I did not log in the notebook. The encounter was an absence of an encounter. The sound occurred during one of my evenings, but I did not go out to the walkway because I was unwell. I had a fever. I had decided that one missed round would not matter. I had stayed in the lockhouse. I had heard no further sounds. I had assumed the situation had passed." He said, 3 nights later, I heard footsteps in the lockhouse. The footsteps were on the kitchen floor. I was upstairs in my bedroom. I went to the top of the staircase. There was a man at the bottom of the staircase. The man was the man from the boat. The man was looking up at me. I retreated to my bedroom. I locked the door. I stayed in the bedroom for the rest of the night. The man did not come up the stairs. I heard the back door open and close. The footsteps stopped. He said, "I did not log the encounter in the notebook because I was not certain whether the encounter had been related to my missed round or whether the encounter had been an unrelated escalation. I was also embarrassed. I had missed a round and had then experienced an indoor encounter, and I had not wanted to record the connection in case it would, by recording it, become a permanent part of the procedure. I was hoping the encounter had been a one-time event. I was hoping that resuming the standard procedure would be sufficient. I had spent the next 30 years following the standard procedure without missing any further rounds, and I had not had another indoor encounter. I had come to think that the indoor encounter had been a single event that was not necessarily connected to the missed round. He said, "Your encounter tonight is the second indoor encounter that I am aware of, after the one I had in 1995. The pattern across the two encounters suggests that missing the acknowledgement, whether by being absent from the rounds or by being present without seeing the boat, may be the trigger for the indoor encounter. I am sorry I did not include the 1995 encounter in the notebook. I should have. The encounter would have warned you that the absence of the boat is not the same as the absence of the situation, and in that the situation can move into the lock house if the acknowledgement does not occur." I asked him what I should do. He said, "I do not know. I had only one indoor encounter. The man did not come up the stairs in my case. The man did come up the stairs in your case. The escalation between my encounter and yours suggests that the situation may be more serious than what I experienced. I do not have a procedure for what you experienced. I am sorry." I asked him whether he had any general advice. He said, "I would suggest you go back to the standard procedures for the rest of the off-season and try to do them as carefully as you can. If you observe the boat in any further encounters, do the acknowledgement correctly. Do not miss any rounds. Do not be absent from the walkway during the times when the boat might appear. As if you do all of this and the indoor encounter does not repeat, then the missed acknowledgement from February 8th was probably the cause, and your return to the standard procedure should be sufficient." He continued, "If the indoor encounter does repeat, even though you are following the standard procedures correctly, then the situation has changed in a way that the procedures cannot address. In that case, I would suggest you leave the lockkeeper position. I would not normally tell a new lockkeeper to leave the position. I am telling you because the indoor encounter is outside what I have been able to manage during my own tenure, and I do not want you to remain in a situation that is escalating beyond what the procedures can handle." I asked him what would happen if I left. He said, "The Canal Corporation would hire a replacement. The replacement would be given the same position you were given. The replacement would presumably encounter the same situation. The procedures in my notebook would still be available since you would presumably leave the notebook for the replacement, but the procedures would be incomplete given what you have experienced. The replacement would be in a worse position than you have been in because the situation has been escalating across multiple lock keepers and is likely to continue to escalate." He paused. He said, "I want to acknowledge that I am giving you advice that protects you at the expense of whoever comes after you. I am aware of this. I do not have better advice to give. I have spent 31 years on this lock, and I do not know how to address the underlying situation. I have only the procedures that I developed, which are now demonstrating their limits. I am sorry." I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I would think about what he had said. I told him I would let him know what I decided. We hung up. I sat at the kitchen table. The lock house was quiet. The clock above the kitchen sink was reading 4:11 in the morning. The sun would not rise for several more hours. I tried to think about what to do. I had options. I could leave the lock house immediately and drive to the nearest town to wait until daylight. I could remain in the lock house, lock the doors and the bedroom door, and try to wait out the night without further incident. I could go back outside and try to do the rounds I would have normally done at 4 in the morning, in the hope that doing the rounds might somehow reset the situation. I considered each option. I rejected the first option because I would not have known how to explain my absence to the Canal Corporation if anything went wrong during my time away from the lock. I rejected the third option because going back outside, without knowing whether the situation was over, felt like the kind of action that would create more problems than it would solve. I chose the second option. I would remain in the lock house. I would lock the doors. I would wait out the night. I went around the lock house and verified that the doors and windows were locked. The lock house had 4 exterior doors, including the front door, the back door, a side door that led to the small wood storage area, and a basement door. I checked all 4. The front door, the back door, and the side door were locked. The basement door was locked. And although the lock was old and required a specific key that was on the key ring Walter had given me, I verified that the basement door was secure. I went back upstairs to my bedroom. I locked the bedroom door. I sat on the bed. I did not turn off the light. I waited. I want to tell you what happened during the rest of the night, because the events were the kind of events that have shaped my approach to the position since. At approximately 4:40 in the morning, I heard a sound from outside the lock house. The sound was the sound of footsteps on the wooden steps that led from the back porch down to the path. The footsteps were going down the steps. The footsteps were the same slow and deliberate footsteps I had heard inside the house earlier. The footsteps continued along the path. The path led from the lock house to the walkway, and the path was made of crushed gravel. Footsteps on the gravel were audible from inside the lock house, if the lock house was quiet, and if the listener was attentive. I was attentive. The footsteps moved along the gravel path. They reached the walkway. The walkway was wooden. The footsteps continued onto the walkway and along it, in the direction of the lower pool of the lock. The footsteps stopped at what I estimated was the section of the walkway that overlooked the position where the boat had been visible during the previous encounters. The footsteps did not move for several minutes. Then I heard a sound. The sound was a single soft splash. The sound was the kind of sound that an object makes when it enters water from a small height. The sound came from the direction of the lower pool. After the splash, the lock house was quiet. I did not hear any further footsteps. I did not hear the back door open. I did not hear anyone return to the lock house. I waited in my bedroom for the rest of the night. I did not sleep. I watched the clock on my bedside table move from 4:47 to 5:30 to 6:15 to 7:04, when the first light of morning began to show through my bedroom window. I waited until full daylight. I checked my watch at 7:30. I unlocked my bedroom door. I went downstairs. I checked the lock house carefully. The kitchen looked normal. The back door was still locked, in the same condition I had left it in when I had checked it earlier. There was no sign that anyone had been in the lock house during the night, except for the dust on the kitchen floor, which had been disturbed in places that suggested someone had walked through. The disturbance was not a clear set of footprints. It was the kind of disturbance that you would notice only if you were looking for it. I put on my coat and boots. I went outside. The sky was overcast. The temperature was still below freezing, but had risen from the deep cold of the previous night. I walked from the lock house to the walkway. I walked along the walkway to the section that overlooked the lower pool. I looked at the water. The water was partially covered with thin ice. The ice had been in approximately the same condition the previous evening. There was no sign of any boat. There was no sign of anything in the water. I walked the length of the walkway. I checked the gate seals and the water levels, the way I would normally check them on a morning round. Everything was in order. I walked back along the walkway toward the lock house. As I walked, I noticed something on the walkway boards. I stopped and looked. There was a single wet footprint on the walkway. The footprint was the size of a man's foot. The footprint was wet, despite the cold and the lack of precipitation overnight. The footprint was pointing in the direction of the lock house. The footprint was the only one. There were no other footprints leading to or from it. I stood on the walkway and I looked at the footprint for a long time. I thought about what Walter had described in his notebook entry from 2014, when he had attempted to leave the immediate area of the walkway during a sighting and had retreated to the lock house and had found a single wet footprint on the walkway the next morning. The footprint I was looking at was the same kind of footprint. The location was the same. The condition was the same. The orientation pointing toward the lock house was the same. I went back to the lock house. I went into the kitchen. I sat at the table. I tried to think about what to do. I called Walter again at 9 in the morning. I was hoping his wife would not answer this time, because I had been embarrassed about waking her at 3:47 in the morning the previous night. He answered on the second ring. He said he had been waiting for my call. I told him about the footsteps on the path and the walkway. I told him about the splash. I told him about the wet footprint I had found in the morning. I asked him whether the footprint matched what he had described in his 2014 entry. He said it did. He said the location was the same, the orientation was the same, and the wet condition was the same. He said the footprint in 2014 had appeared after he had retreated from the walkway during a sighting, when the man in the boat had stood up and had begun to walk on the water toward him. And he said the footprint in my case had appeared after I had been inside the lock house and had heard the man walk along the path, onto the walkway, and into the water. He said the two footprints were the same kind of trace, even though the circumstances of their appearance had been different. I asked him what he thought the footprint meant. He said, "I have been thinking about it for 31 years, and I do not have a clear answer. I think the footprint is a marker. I think the footprint indicates that the man has been at the location and has gone back to wherever he comes from. I think the footprint is left as evidence that an interaction has occurred. I do not know whether the footprint is intentional, in the sense that the man chooses to leave it, or whether the footprint is a byproduct. It's in the sense that, wherever the man comes from has water on it, and the water gets transferred to the walkway when he steps on it. I have considered both possibilities. I have not been able to determine which is correct. I asked him what I should do with the footprint. He said, "Do nothing. Do not photograph it. Do not measure it. Do not try to preserve it. The footprint will dry and disappear within a few hours, depending on the temperature. The footprint will not leave any permanent mark on the walkway. The footprint is, in some sense, only there for you to see. Once you have seen it, the function of the footprint has been fulfilled." I asked him whether I should still consider leaving the lockkeeper position. He said, "Daniel, the events of last night were the events I had told you would, if they repeated, suggest that you should leave. I am going to repeat that suggestion. I am also going to add some additional context because the events of last night went beyond what I had experienced in 1995. The events of last night involved the man entering the lock house, coming up the staircase, and then leaving on his own. The events involved sounds that suggested the man returned to the water. The events involved the wet footprint as a marker. The combination of these elements is more elaborate than what I have personally observed. I am giving you this assessment because I want you to have my honest evaluation. The situation is escalating. The escalation may continue. I cannot predict where it will go. I asked him what he would do if he were in my position. He said, "I would leave. I would have left after the indoor encounter, and I would not wait for any further escalation. I would resign from the Canal Corporation. I would explain my resignation as a personal decision related to the isolation of the position, which is a common reason for lockkeepers to leave, and the Canal Corporation would accept that explanation without requiring further detail. I would find another position. I would not return to the lockkeeper line of work. I asked him whether he thought the situation would follow me if I left. He said, "I do not know." The situation has been at the lock for at least the entire span of my tenure, and probably for the full century the lock has been operational. The situation has not, by any account I have been able to gather, followed any of the previous lock keepers when they have left. Edward Halloran left in 1923 and died in 1924, but his death was attributed to pneumonia and was not, by any contemporary account I could find, related to anything resembling the situation. James Whitfield retired in 1947 and lived until 1971, and his death was the death of an elderly man at the end of a normal lifespan. Margaret Doyle lived until 1971, after retiring in 1962, and her death was also normal. Frank Castellano was incarcerated after his arrest, but he was released and lived until 2008, and his death was unrelated. Robert Adamson died in 1985 in the automobile accident, but the accident was on the Canal access road and was investigated as a routine accident. Lyle Brennan retired in 1993 and died in 1998 of a heart condition. None of the previous lock keepers, by any account I have been able to access, experienced anything resembling the situation after they left the lock. Yet the situation appears to be tied to the lock rather than to the keeper. I told him I appreciated the assessment. I told him I would think about what to do. I told him I would call him back within a few days. We hung up. I sat at the kitchen table. I made coffee. I tried to think. I want to tell you what I decided, because the decision shaped the rest of my time at the lock and has shaped what I am doing now. I decided to stay. I decided this for reasons that I want to acknowledge are not particularly heroic. I had been in the position for less than 4 months. I had moved my belongings from Pennsylvania. I had given up my apartment there. I had no clear next position lined up if I left. I had been laid off from my previous job, and the layoff had affected my employment record. I did not want to add a short-term lockkeeper position that I had abandoned after 4 months to my employment record. I needed the income. I needed the housing. I needed the position. I also decided to stay because I had come to think, in the hours since my call with Walter, that leaving would not necessarily resolve the situation. The situation had been at the lock for over 100 years, by Walter's research. The situation had affected previous lockkeepers in various ways during their tenures, and had then released them when they had left the position. The situation would continue with whoever replaced me. The replacement would be in a worse position than I was, because the replacement would not have the benefit of Walter's notebook plus my own additions. Sheldon would have to develop their own procedures from scratch in the face of an escalating phenomenon. I made a list of the ways I could try to address the situation differently. I made the list at the kitchen table on the morning of February 9th, in the hours after my call with Walter. The list had 4 items. The first item was to attempt to acknowledge the man even when the boat was not visible. I thought about whether the procedure might be modifiable to address the situation that had occurred on February 8th, when the sound had occurred, but the boat had not appeared. The acknowledgement Walter had developed had been built around the visible boat, but the underlying function might have been to acknowledge the man's presence in some form. I considered whether I could perform the acknowledgement based on the sound alone, and without waiting for the boat to appear. The second item was to attempt to learn more about Edward Halloran. Walter had researched Edward extensively and had not been able to identify whether the man in the boat was Edward or someone else. I considered whether further research, with access to records that Walter might not have accessed, could yield additional information that might help me understand the situation. The third item was to attempt to communicate with the man directly during a sighting. The procedure had been built around minimal interaction. The interaction had been limited to the brief acknowledgement. I considered whether more extensive interaction, with appropriate caution, might yield information about what the man wanted. The fourth item was to leave the position, as Walter had advised, and to accept the consequences of leaving for whoever came after me. I considered each item carefully. I rejected the fourth item for the reasons I have already described. I rejected the third item because I had observed, the previous night, that the man could enter the lock house and could come up to the second floor, and I did not want to invite further escalation by attempting to communicate with him during a sighting. I considered the first item and the second item to be the more promising options. I decided to start with the second item. I decided to research Edward Halloran in greater depth than Walter had been able to, using resources that had become available since Walter had done his research in the 1990s. The internet had not been available to Walter at the time he had done most of his research, and I had internet access at the lock house through a satellite-based system that the Canal Corporation had installed in 2018, which provided slow but functional connectivity. I would use the internet to research Edward and any related individuals. I spent the next several weeks doing this research. I was off shift during the day, since the lock was closed for the off-season, and my duties were limited to overnight monitoring and to morning maintenance checks. I had hours each day available for research. I used them. I want to give you what I found, because what I found has changed my understanding of the situation. Edward Halloran was born in 1885 in a small village in County Mayo, Ireland. He emigrated to the United States in 1903 at age 18. He arrived at Ellis Island and settled in upstate New York, where he had a cousin who had emigrated several years earlier. He worked as a laborer on various construction projects in the early 1900s. He was hired by the New York State Barge Canal Authority in 1916 as a laborer on the construction of Lock 17 and the surrounding section of the canal. He was promoted to lockkeeper when the lock became operational in 1918, on the basis of his familiarity with the construction and his demonstrated reliability during the 2 years of construction work. He served as lockkeeper from 1918 until 1923. He took sick leave in October 1923, citing what was described as respiratory illness with associated nervous exhaustion. He was hospitalized at a regional hospital in Utica from October 1923 until February 1924. Said he was released from the hospital in February 1924 and was sent to live with his cousin in Rochester. He died in March 1924 of pneumonia at age 39. This was the information Walter had been able to find. I confirmed it through multiple sources. I found additional information that Walter had not found. I found that Edward had been engaged to be married at the time of his sick leave. His fiancée was a woman named Catherine O'Brien, who was 26 years old and who had been working as a teacher in a small town near the lock. Catherine and Edward had been engaged in the spring of 1923 and had been planning to marry in November of that year. The wedding had been canceled when Edward had taken sick leave in October. Catherine had visited Edward at the hospital in Utica several times during his hospitalization, and if she had not married him while he was in the hospital, she had not married anyone else after his death. She had continued to teach in the town near the lock until 1942, when she had retired at age 45 due to her own ill health. She had died in 1948 at age 51. She had been buried in the same cemetery as Edward, in adjacent plots that had been purchased by Edward's cousin in 1924, after Edward's death, when the cousin had arranged for both Edward's burial and the eventual burial of Catherine, at Catherine's request. I found this information in newspaper archives, in church records that had been digitized and made available online, and in the records of the cemetery where they were buried. I found additional information about the circumstances of Edward's sick leave in 1923. The Canal Corporation's archives, which had been partially digitized in the 2000s, contained Edward's personnel file. The file included a letter from Edward's supervisor, dated October 14, 1923, recommending that Edward be granted sick leave. The letter described Edward's condition in some detail. Edward had been observed by the supervisor during a visit to the lock on October 12, 1923, to be in a state of significant distress. Edward had been unable to perform his duties. He had been speaking incoherently about events at the lock that the supervisor had been unable to verify. He had been refusing to leave the lock house except for the most essential rounds. He had been requesting that the Canal Corporation install additional lighting along the canal at night, which the supervisor had noted was not feasible given the budget and the remoteness of the location. And the letter included a brief summary of what Edward had been saying. The supervisor had paraphrased Edward's statements rather than quoting them directly. The summary said, in part, that Edward had been describing the appearance of a small boat on the canal during overnight hours, with a single occupant who Edward believed was waiting for him. Edward had been telling the supervisor that the occupant had been getting closer to the lock house with each appearance, and that Edward was concerned that the occupant would, at some point, come into the lock house. The supervisor had concluded that Edward was suffering from nervous exhaustion brought on by the isolation of the position and by the long hours of solitary overnight work. The supervisor had recommended sick leave. The Canal Corporation had granted the leave, and Edward had been transported to the hospital in Utica 2 days later. I found additional information in the hospital records, which had been preserved in a regional archive and which had been made accessible through a state historical society project in the 2000s. Edward's hospital records described his condition during his 4 months at the hospital. He had been treated for what the hospital records called neurasthenia with paranoid features. The treatment had consisted of bed rest, regular meals, supervised activity, and occasional sessions with a hospital physician who had attempted to discuss Edward's experiences at the lock with him. Edward had, during the early weeks of his hospitalization, continued to describe the boat and the occupant. He had told the physician that the occupant had been a man who had been waiting for him, that the occupant had been there since Edward had first started at the lock in 1918, and that the occupant had been waiting longer than Edward had been at the lock. The physician's notes recorded Edward saying that the occupant had been at the lock since the construction had begun in 1916. Edward had described seeing the occupant during the construction, when Edward had been working as a laborer on the project. Edward had told the physician that he had not mentioned the occupant during the construction because he had not wanted to be considered unreliable by his supervisors. He had told the physician that the occupant had been visible during certain overnight hours when Edward had been working late shifts. He had told the physician that other workers had also seen the occupant, and that the workers had developed an informal understanding among themselves that they would not discuss the occupant openly because doing so would have led to professional consequences for anyone who reported the sightings. Edward had told the physician that the occupant had become more active after the lock had become operational in 1918. The occupant had appeared more frequently. The occupant had moved closer to the lock house during the appearances. Edward had developed a routine of acknowledging the occupant verbally, on the theory that acknowledgement would prevent further escalation. The acknowledgement had worked for several years, with the occupant appearing at irregular intervals but not approaching the lock house. The acknowledgement had begun to fail in the summer of 1923, yet the occupant had begun to approach the lock house despite the acknowledgements. Edward had developed a fear that the occupant would, at some point, enter the lock house. The physician's notes recorded that Edward had become less coherent over the course of his hospitalization. He had stopped describing the boat and the occupant in detail by December 1923. He had become withdrawn and had spoken less. The physician had attributed the change to a worsening of his neurasthenia. Edward had been released in February 1924 with a recommendation that he not return to the lockkeeper position. He had gone to live with his cousin in Rochester. He had died of pneumonia in March 1924. I found additional information about Edward's experiences before he was hired by the Canal Corporation. The information was less complete, but it provided some context. Edward had been involved in an incident in 1908, 15 years before his sick leave. The incident had involved a death at a different construction site where Edward had been working as a laborer. A co-worker of Edward's had drowned in a flooded section of an excavation site during a heavy rain. Edward had been one of the workers who had been with the co-worker at the time of the drowning. The death had been investigated as an accident. Edward had not been blamed for the death. The co-worker had been a man named Eugene Brennan, who had been 24 years old at the time of his death. Eugene had been Edward's friend. I found this information in newspaper archives from 1908. The newspaper had covered the drowning briefly. The newspaper had identified Eugene Brennan by name and had identified Edward Halloran as one of the witnesses. The newspaper had not provided detailed information about the circumstances of the drowning. I found one additional piece of information that I want to share with you because the piece of information has shaped my interpretation of what may be happening at the lock. I found that Eugene Brennan had been described in his obituary as a man who had emigrated from Ireland in 1905. He had been from County Mayo, the same county Edward had come from. He had come to the United States 2 years after Edward. He had worked alongside Edward on several construction projects in the years between 1905 and his death in 1908. He had been Edward's friend since they had been children in Ireland. The obituary did not provide additional personal details, but it did describe Eugene as a man with dark hair and a beard of average height, who had been known for his pleasant manner. The description matched the description Walter had given of the man in the boat. The description matched what I had observed during my own encounters and during the indoor encounter on February 8th. I want to be careful about the conclusion I am drawing. I am not claiming, with certainty, that the man in the boat is Eugene Brennan. The description matches in general terms, but the description is not specific enough to constitute a definitive identification. The man in the boat could have been someone else who happened to share the general physical characteristics. The match could be coincidental. I am noting, however, that the match exists and that the match provides a possible explanation for the situation that Walter had not been able to identify. This possible explanation is that Edward had been haunted, in some sense, by the death of his friend Eugene, and that the haunting had begun during the construction of the lock and had continued through Edward's tenure as lockkeeper. The haunting had escalated to the point where Edward had been unable to continue and had been hospitalized. The haunting had not, however, ended with Edward's hospitalization or with his death. The haunting had continued at the lock and had attached itself to the position of lockkeeper rather than to Edward specifically. Each subsequent lockkeeper had inherited the haunting and had developed procedures to manage it. I want to acknowledge the speculative nature of this interpretation. I am offering it as a possible explanation rather than as a definitive one. The interpretation fits the available evidence, but is not the only interpretation that fits. The interpretation does, however, suggest a possible course of action that I had not previously considered. The course of action was to acknowledge Eugene Brennan by name. I had been performing the acknowledgement using the words Walter had developed, which had referred to the man as a generic presence rather than as a specific person. The acknowledgement had become a ritual that had been refined over decades of practice, but that had not, as far as I knew, ever been personalized. If the man in the boat was Eugene Brennan, then acknowledging him by name might have an effect that the generic acknowledgement did not have. I considered whether to attempt this. I considered it for several weeks. I researched Eugene further. I confirmed his birth and death dates through additional sources. I confirmed his identity as a friend of Edward Halloran. I confirmed the circumstances of his death. I made a decision in early March. I decided I would attempt the personalized acknowledgement during the next encounter with the boat. I did not know when the next encounter would occur. The encounters had been irregular. I would simply wait for the next one, and then I would adjust my acknowledgement. The next encounter occurred on the night of March 23rd. The pattern was the standard pattern. I heard the sound at approximately 1:30 in the morning. I prepared for my rounds. I went out at 2 o'clock. I walked to the section of the walkway that overlooked the lower pool. The boat was on the water. The occupant was sitting in the boat, facing the lock house. As I stopped on the walkway, I considered what to say. I had been planning to address the man as Eugene Brennan. I had practiced the words. I tried to remember them. I spoke out loud. I said, "Eugene Brennan, I see you. I am the lock keeper. I am going about my duties. Edward is no longer at this lock. Edward died in 1924. He has not been here for 100 years. I am here. I am following the procedures the lock keepers have developed since Edward. I am acknowledging your presence." The occupant did not move at first. He sat in the boat as he had sat during every previous encounter I had observed. Then he stood up. He had not stood up during any of my previous encounters. The standing up was the behavior Walter had described from his 2014 encounter, at the encounter that had ended with the man stepping onto the water and walking toward Walter. I did not retreat. I had been planning, when I had decided to attempt the personalized acknowledgement, that I would not retreat regardless of what happened. I had decided that retreating would be a worse outcome than whatever the man might do if I did not retreat. The man stood in the boat. He turned to face me directly. The previous encounters had involved him facing the lock house, but at an angle, with the boat positioned in such a way that he had not been looking at me specifically. The current orientation was different. He was looking at me. I could see his face more clearly than I had been able to see it during previous encounters. The moonlight was strong that night. The face matched the description in Eugene Brennan's obituary. Dark hair, a beard, average height. A face that in a different context would have been a pleasant face. The man raised one hand. He held it at the level of his shoulder. He did not move toward me. He stood in the boat with his hand raised. I waited. I tried to think about what to do. The man was making a gesture. The gesture was not threatening. The gesture was the kind of gesture that a person would make to acknowledge another person who had spoken to them, the way you might raise a hand in response to a greeting from someone across a street. I raised my own hand. I held it at the level of my shoulder. I held it for approximately 10 seconds. The man lowered his hand. I lowered mine. The man sat back down in the boat. He resumed the position he had held in every previous encounter, facing the lock house, not moving. I continued my rounds. I walked the length of the walkway. I checked the gate seals and the water levels. The boat remained in position during my rounds. I returned along the walkway. I glanced at the water. The boat was no longer there. I returned to the lock house. I logged the encounter in detail. I described the personalized acknowledgement. I described the standing up. I described the gesture. I described the mutual hand raising. I described my conclusion, which was that the personalized acknowledgement had produced a different response than the generic acknowledgement had produced, and that the response had been a recognition rather than an escalation. I want to tell you what has happened in the months since the March 23rd encounter, because the months have been the test of whether the personalized acknowledgement was the correct adjustment. The encounters with the boat have continued, although the pattern has changed. The encounters have become less frequent. I have had 4 encounters in the 7 months since March 23rd, compared to 4 encounters in the 3 months between December 18th and March 23rd. The encounters have been shorter. The boat has been visible for less time during each encounter. The hand gesture has occurred during each of the 4 subsequent encounters. The man stands up. He raises his hand. I raise my hand. He lowers his hand. He sits back down. I continue my rounds. The encounter ends. The indoor encounters have not recurred. The man has not entered the lockhouse since the night of February 8th. There have been no further footsteps on the staircase. There have been no further wet footprints on the walkway in the mornings. Yet I have continued to follow the standard procedures from Walter's notebook. I have added the personalized acknowledgement as a modification to the standard procedure. I have logged each encounter in detail. I have not contacted Walter again. I have not told him about the personalized acknowledgement or about the change in the encounters. I have not been sure whether the change is permanent or temporary. I have not wanted to give Walter information that might turn out to be wrong if the situation changes again. I have decided to wait and observe before sharing my findings with him. I have also not contacted the Canal Corporation. I have continued to file the routine reports that the position requires. I have not mentioned the situation in any of my reports. The corporation has not asked me about anything beyond the routine matters. I am recording this account because I have come to think that the situation may be changing in ways that I am not certain about, and because I want there to be a record outside of my own head and outside of the lockhouse. I have made significant modifications to Walter's procedures based on my own research and my own decisions. The modifications have, by my observation, produced positive results. The modifications have not, however, addressed the underlying situation. The man is still at the lock. The boat still appears. The acknowledgement is still required. The procedure has been improved, but the procedure has not eliminated the need for itself. I want to tell you what I have decided to do over the rest of my time at the lock, because the decisions are the part of this story that I am still in the process of making. I have decided to remain at the lock for at least the next 2 years. The decision is not permanent. I am evaluating it on an ongoing basis. The decision is based on my current assessment, which is that the situation has stabilized at a manageable level since the personalized acknowledgement was introduced, and that leaving now would mean abandoning the procedural improvements I have developed and forcing the next lockkeeper to start from scratch with Walter's original notebook. I have decided to expand my research into Eugene Brennan and into the construction crew of 1916 to 1918. I have come to think that the situation at the lock may have additional dimensions that I have not yet identified. The personalized acknowledgement has improved the situation, but has not resolved it. The man still appears, the boat still arrives, and the procedure is still required. I want to know whether there is more to the story than the death of one construction worker in 1908. I want to know whether other workers on the lock construction crew encountered the situation, whether other deaths occurred during the construction, whether anything happened during the construction that might have created the conditions under which the situation became permanent. I have made some progress on this research. I have identified the names of approximately 40 workers who were on the construction crew between 1916 and 1918. The crew records were preserved in the Canal Corporation's archives. I have been working through the names systematically, looking for any obituaries, court records, or other documents that might shed light on what happened during the construction. I have found, so far, that 3 of the workers died during the construction. 1 was killed in a workplace accident in 1916. 1 died of influenza during the 1918 epidemic. 1 drowned in the canal in 1917, in circumstances that the contemporary newspaper coverage described as suspicious. The drowning is the one I am currently focused on. The drowned worker was a man named Patrick Whelan. He was 29 years old at the time of his death. He had been working on the construction of Lock 17 for approximately 15 months. He had been from Ireland. He had been a friend of Edward Halloran. The newspaper coverage of his death noted that the drowning had occurred in a section of the canal that was under construction at the time. The body had been found by Edward Halloran. The investigation had been conducted by the local sheriff's office. If the investigation had concluded that the drowning was an accident, the investigation had not been thorough. I have been trying to determine whether Patrick Whelan's death might be relevant to the situation at the lock. I have not, so far, been able to make a clear connection. The man in the boat does not match the description of Patrick Whelan by the limited descriptions I have been able to find. The man in the boat matches Eugene Brennan, but the existence of 2 deaths of friends of Edward Halloran, occurring within 9 years of each other, both in circumstances involving water, is the kind of pattern that I want to understand more fully. I have also been thinking about the broader question of why the situation appears to be tied to the lockkeeper position rather than to a specific person. Ed Walter's research had established that the situation has affected every lockkeeper at Lock 17, beginning with Edward Halloran and continuing through the present. The situation has not, by Walter's research, followed any of the previous lockkeepers when they have left the position. The situation has stayed at the lock. I have come to think that the situation may be tied to the lock structure itself in some way that I do not understand. The lock was constructed between 1916 and 1918. The construction was overseen by Edward Halloran in the role of laborer and was then operated by him in the role of lockkeeper from 1918 until 1923. Edward was, in some sense, the person who was most closely associated with the construction and the early operation of the lock. He was the person who experienced the situation most acutely, yet he was the person who developed the original procedures for managing it. The procedures were passed from Edward to James Whitfield in 1923, although Edward was not directly involved in the handover, since Edward was already in the hospital by the time James took over. The procedures were passed in some form, however, possibly through other workers who had been associated with Edward. The procedures continued to be passed through subsequent lockkeepers, with each lockkeeper contributing modifications and refinements. I have been thinking about whether the situation could be addressed by something more substantial than the procedural management that has been ongoing for over 100 years. I have been thinking about whether the underlying cause of the situation could be addressed in some way that would allow the situation to end. And I have not arrived at any clear answers. I have only the speculation that the situation may be tied to the deaths of Edward's friends, that the situation may have been somehow trapped at the lock by the construction process, and that the situation may require some kind of acknowledgement or release that the procedural management has not provided. The speculation is not actionable in any specific way that I can identify. I am noting it as the current state of my thinking. I want to tell you what I have decided about the future of the procedures and the notebook, because the decisions are relevant to whoever may eventually take over the position from me. I have decided to maintain Walter's notebook in its original form, with my own additions on separate pages at the back. I have not modified Walter's original entries. and so I have added my own entries chronologically, with dates and detailed descriptions. The notebook now contains over 100 pages of entries, going back to 1993, with my own contributions making up the most recent 30 pages. I have decided to add a cover letter to the notebook that summarizes the key procedures and the key research findings. The cover letter will be the first thing that the next lockkeeper reads. The cover letter will tell them what the notebook contains, why it was developed, and what the key procedures are. The cover letter will recommend that they read the entire notebook before their first overnight shift, and that they call me if they have questions. I have decided to leave a phone number where the next lockkeeper can reach me. I have not yet decided where I will be living when I eventually leave the position, and I will leave a number that will work at the time I leave. I have decided not to contact the Canal Corporation about the situation. I have considered multiple times in the past several months whether to file a report with the corporation that would document the situation and would request institutional support for managing it. I have decided not to file such a report. The reasons are similar to the reasons that Walter and the previous lockkeepers have not filed such reports. The corporation would not have a framework for handling the situation. The corporation would, by my best estimate, either dismiss the report and consider me unreliable, or take the report seriously and shut down the lock for some kind of investigation that would result in the lock being unmanned for an extended period. Neither outcome would be useful. But the procedural management that the lockkeepers have developed over 100 years is, by my assessment, the best available approach to the situation, and the management requires a lockkeeper to be on site to perform it. I have decided to maintain regular contact with Walter for as long as he is willing to talk. He is 68 years old. He is in good health. He could be available for many more years. I have called him a few times since my call with him on the morning of February 9th. I have not told him about the personalized acknowledgement or about the change in the encounters. I have decided I will tell him eventually, after I am more confident that the change is sustained. I want to give him the satisfaction of knowing that the procedures he developed have been improved on and that the situation has become more manageable than it was during his tenure. I want to tell you about the most recent encounter, which occurred 2 weeks ago on the night of October 8th. The encounter followed the pattern that has been consistent since March 23rd. I heard the sound at approximately 1:25 in the morning. I prepared for my rounds. I went out at 2 o'clock. I walked to the section of the walkway that overlooked the lower pool. The boat was on the water. The man was sitting in the boat, facing the lockhouse. I stopped on the walkway. I spoke the personalized acknowledgement. I said the words I have been saying for the past 7 months. Eugene Brennan, I see you. I am the lockkeeper. I am going about my duties. Edward is no longer at this lock. Edward died in 1924. He has not been here for 100 years. I am here. I am following the procedures the lockkeepers have developed since Edward. I am acknowledging your presence. The man stood up. He raised his hand. I raised mine. We held the gesture for the standard 10 seconds. He lowered his hand. I lowered mine. Then he did something he had not done before. He spoke. The voice was distant. The voice was the kind of voice that you would hear from someone calling across a body of water on a still night, audible, but with the quality that water adds to sound. The voice was a man's voice. The voice was, by the accent I could detect, an Irish voice. The voice said, "Tell Edward I am still waiting. Tell him I will wait as long as is needed. Tell him I do not blame him. Tell him to come when he is able." I stood on the walkway. Then I tried to think about what to say. I had not anticipated the man speaking. The procedure had not addressed the possibility of speech. I had no scripted response. I spoke. I said, "Edward died in 1924. Edward cannot come." The man stood in the boat. He did not respond immediately. After what I would estimate was approximately 20 seconds, he spoke again. He said, "I know." He sat down in the boat. He resumed the sitting position. He did not say anything else. I continued my rounds. I walked the length of the walkway. I checked the gate seals and the water levels. The boat remained in position. I returned along the walkway. I glanced at the water. The boat was no longer there. I returned to the lockhouse. I sat at the kitchen table. I logged the encounter in detail. I described the speech, the questions, the responses. I tried to be as accurate as I could about the words that had been used. I have been thinking about the encounter for the past 2 weeks. I have been thinking about what the man said. I have been thinking about what he meant. The man said he was waiting for Edward. The man said he did not blame Edward. The man said he knew Edward had died. The combination of these statements suggests that the man understands that Edward is dead and that he has been waiting at the lock for some kind of resolution that involves Edward, even though Edward cannot come. The man is, in some sense, waiting for a resolution that cannot occur in any conventional sense. I have been thinking about whether there is something I could do that would constitute a resolution from Edward's perspective, even though Edward is not present. I have been thinking about whether I could speak on Edward's behalf, the way a person might speak on behalf of a deceased relative at a memorial service. I have been thinking about whether such speech, if it were sincere, and if it were grounded in what I know about Edward and Eugene, could have an effect. I have not yet made a decision about whether to attempt this. I am thinking about it carefully. I am aware that any attempt could backfire. I am aware that I could say something wrong, that I could attribute thoughts or feelings to Edward that he did not have, that I could make a claim about his attitude toward Eugene that turned out to be inaccurate. I am aware that the attempt could escalate the situation rather than resolving it. I am also aware that the attempt could, if it were successful, be the resolution that has not occurred in the past 100 years. The attempt could be the thing that ends the situation. The attempt could allow Eugene to leave, allow the lock to return to a normal operational state, allow whoever takes over the position from me to inherit a lock that does not have the situation attached to it. I want to tell you what I am going to do. I am going to attempt to speak on Edward's behalf during the next encounter. I am going to prepare the speech carefully. I am going to base the speech on what I know about Edward and Eugene from the historical records I have been able to access. I am going to speak words that, by my best estimate, Edward would have wanted to say to Eugene if he had been able to. I am going to acknowledge what happened in 1908. I am going to acknowledge Eugene's death. I am going to express, on Edward's behalf, the regret that Edward presumably carried for the rest of his life, and that may have contributed to his nervous breakdown in 1923. I am going to tell Eugene that Edward would have wanted him to be at peace. I am going to do this with the understanding that I may be wrong about Edward's feelings. I am going to do it with the understanding that I am taking a risk. I am going to do it because the alternative is to continue with the current procedures indefinitely, with no end in sight, and with the knowledge that the next lockkeeper will inherit the situation. I am recording this account because I want there to be a record of my reasoning before I make the attempt. If the attempt is successful, the recording will document how I arrived at the decision. If the attempt is not successful, the recording will document what I tried so that whoever comes after me can learn from my mistake and avoid repeating it. The next encounter is likely to occur within the next few weeks, based on the recent pattern. The encounters have been occurring at intervals of approximately 3 to 5 weeks since March. The most recent encounter was 2 weeks ago. The next one should occur in the next 1 to 3 weeks. I am preparing the speech. I am writing it down so that I will have it memorized when the time comes. I am refining it. I want it to be as honest and as accurate as I can make it. I want to give a final thought to whoever may eventually hear this recording, beyond the next lock keeper. I want to acknowledge that the situation I have described is the kind of situation that, in conventional contexts, would be dismissed. Shout the man on the lake in a boat that disappears, the footsteps in the lock house, the wet footprints, the speech across the water, the personal connections to events from over a century ago. These elements do not fit any framework that I have any standing to validate. I cannot prove what I have observed. I can only describe it. I have considered repeatedly that I might be experiencing some kind of psychological condition that has produced the experiences. I have considered that the historical research might be selection bias, in which I have constructed a narrative around historical figures who happen to fit a pattern I want to see. I have considered that the entire situation might be a complex misperception that I have built into a coherent story over the months I have spent at the lock. Now, I have not been able to rule out these possibilities entirely. I have, however, been able to consider them carefully. I have continued to function in my position. I have continued to do the routine work. I have continued to file the routine reports. The Canal Corporation has not raised any concerns about my performance. By the conventional measures of mental health and professional competence, I am functioning normally. I have also had Walter's notebook as a reference point. The notebook documents experiences over 31 years that match what I have observed. The notebook provides a baseline against which I can compare my own observations. The notebook does not, by itself, prove that the situation is real. The notebook does, however, suggest that I am not the only person who has experienced these things. Walter experienced them, and if the previous lock keepers, by Walter's research, experienced them. The situation has been observed by multiple people over multiple decades. I am going to attempt the speech on Edward's behalf. I am going to do it during the next encounter. I am going to record what happens in my notebook in detail. I will record an additional installment of this account after the attempt to describe the result. If the attempt succeeds, I will continue at the lock for the rest of my planned tenure, with the knowledge that the situation has been resolved and that the lock can be passed to the next keeper as a normal lock. If the attempt fails, I will need to reconsider my approach. I do not know what I will do if it fails. I will think about it then. I am going to stop recording now. The lock is quiet. The off-season has been over for several months. The lock has been operating normally during the operating season, with the standard traffic of recreational boats passing through during the warmer months. I have been performing the standard duties of the lock-keeper position during the day and have been performing the procedural management of the situation during the overnight hours. The combination has been demanding but has been manageable. I have come to think of the lock as my home in a way that I had not anticipated when I took the position. The isolation that I had been seeking has turned out to be more complicated than I had expected, but the complication has not been entirely negative. I have learned things about the history of this section of the canal that I would not have learned in any other position. Thus, I have developed a relationship with the procedures and with the situation that has, in its own way, become meaningful. I have come to understand why Walter spent 31 years here, and why the previous lock keepers spent the time they spent. The work even with the situation, has its own kind of value. I am going to prepare for the next encounter. I am going to refine the speech. I am going to be ready when the time comes. If you are watching this recording because something has happened to me, or because the next lock keeper has shared the materials I have left, please know that the recording is the most complete account I have been able to produce of what happened during my first year at the lock and during the months that followed. Please share the recording with the next lock keeper if it would be useful. Please consider that the situation at the lock may be ongoing and that the next person in the position will need the information. The lock will continue to operate. The situation will continue to be present in some form, regardless of what I do or what the next keeper does. The procedures will continue to be necessary, in some version, for as long as the lock exists. The chain of management that began with Edward Halloran in 1918 will continue with whoever comes after me and with whoever comes after them, for as long as there is someone willing to take the position. I am going to stop now. The recording is over.